Welcome back to Prime Live. We are on your screens Monday to Friday from 6 to 8. If you are just joining us, the Benchmarks Foundation will be hosting their annual conference next week on the 10th and the 11th of October. The theme for the conference will be the critical raw materials. For whom and at what cost? An array of speakers from the South African Communist Party and activists from Indonesia have been invited to drive these critical conversations. Joining me now to talk more about the theme and why mineral wealth remains a major stumbling block on the continent is Benchmarks Foundation Advocacy and Media Manager Hassen Lorgat. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to INX Prime.
Walaikum salam and thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us to help us unpack this topic and a little bit more about what is going to be discussed at the conference as well. Now, for those who are none the wiser, when you talk about critical raw materials, what exactly are we referring to when we talk about raw materials?
I guess in some ways it is what powerful countries deem necessary to get themselves ahead of the game, because this is a global competitive game. And we've seen through at the time of COVID, when the Europeans had so many vaccines, they were giving their people 3-4 doses and still wanted to keep it in storage, and they didn't have solidarity to give to us. So the game is so wedded against us. At this particular moment, critical raw materials are seen by the European Union, who put China as their competitor. Basically, the European Union has listed a number of minerals, and they are in alliance with the United States of America, politically and otherwise. They say it's minerals such as cobalt, right? Manganese, lithium, rare earth, magnets, those kind of things, silicon, titanium. Now, while Europe needs this, 90% of what they need is in the global south. So what we're trying to suggest in some ways is that we are in a good moment, not that we should be exploited, a good moment to know the value of what we've got, and that the old colonial way of winning, where if they couldn't get it through unfair terms of trade, they'd come in with the army and stuff like that. I mean, you could see the number of coups d'etats against French colonies, because France never really decolonized. We can go back to that. But essentially, these minerals are so important to keep the living standards of the wealthy countries to where they are, while us in the poorer countries have to decide, will we continue this colonial paradigm of selling our raw materials and buying back electronic cars, buying back Apple phones, where most of the cobalt that they need in the mobile phones come from the DRC, manufactured by children, with young children doing this. In fact, I think of my kids who are those ages, and it is tragic that this happens, but they do it in the name of development and in the name of progress.
Absolutely. And I think it's fair to say that it's always been that Africa as a continent has always been rich in resources. And to the extent that Africa has never actually benefited from being so rich in resources. For example, you see the steel manufacturing industry, although the raw material comes from Africa, we then have to send this material through to overseas to actually be manufactured into a working product. But now I find that
a transnational corporation.
Yes. And I find that this call by the Benchmarks Foundation to be quite timeless, as a number of countries on the continent are discovering minerals that will shape the future. As we know, Zimbabwe has Africa's largest lithium deposits.
Yeah, I guess what we're saying, we're not asking for kind of narrow protectionism. But, I don't like even these words about resource nationalism. When Europe protects itself, I mean, look at Indonesia. They tried to put a ban on nickel and lithium because they thought it's strategic. Namibia in some way followed up, and Europe is fighting them differently. What did the European Union do? They took Indonesia to the World Trade Organization, saying it is anti-competitive behavior. Now, these rules of all these organizations didn't have our inputs. They didn't have the powerful lobbies that we're finding now of China and others who were left out, excluded in some ways. But the rules have historically been ruled against us. And now with powerful countries, it's a time for us to reconfigure this relationship. You know, it's a new colonialism that they seek. But, initially, as I said, France did not even decolonize. Niger, it is said that the uranium that Niger provides to France constitutes about 60% of the electricity for France. And then what do you have in Niger? No lights, load shedding, you know? So we need to start thinking about this. If we want to go over this hurdle where we are now of load shedding and that, we must ask, can we use these minerals not to enforce and reinforce corrupt elites? Can they be mined in a way that is just and that the communities that live nearby these benefit? Because often they don't benefit. So we're asking two questions. We want to renegotiate the terms. What are the benefits to communities? Can this mining be based on the right to say no, where people can determine whether they want it or not? But then, because at the current regime, we've studied mining for the last 15, 16 years, the Benchmarks Foundation. We've yet to find one country, one community that has benefited from mining. Every time it gives up its land for mining, it is worse off. So these are the types of questions we want to ask in our conference. How can these communities be better off? How can they not die early because of the cancers and the asthmas that they have? How do we make sure that this mining, if it is desired by the communities, it is desired with their consent? Because they lose now with this thing being sent overseas, you get something through the GDP, but that return doesn't come to provide the health and safety for communities who are dying near these mines. So clearly there's a lot to discuss. So what I was saying to you, that these patterns were set by the colonial regime. If they didn't find their way, the jackboot the army would move in, right? They will try and concoct rules. They will try to make sure that once they've got you as a colony, you have to buy from them for certain, so you become a captive market, right? All these were part of the design of the colonial patterns, and we're asking for a lot, but really it is the least we can do, is to ask big questions, because otherwise the neo-colonialism will continue, and the role of transnational corporations are so dominant, more powerful than governments. So this is a time to ask these questions. Who's buying this? Is this really a needed mineral, or is it simply one that will keep us in the state that we are? These coups d'etats, until recently in Mali and others, most of the coups d'etats in Africa were inspired by the colonial powers who chose the leaders for us. So clearly, and Britain and others talk about free trade only when it suits them. When it doesn't suit them, they go into other patterns. So this is the history of the economic history of the country. Cheap labor inherited from the colonial times. So our government has to start thinking, how do we turn this around? How do we turn around? We've got vanadium mines. We've got all this. Can we team up with Zimbabwe, make a battery factory nearby here? Because that will help cars. Can we build electric cars? Indonesia and others are trying. Apparently, it's not that difficult, So clearly, we have the skills. I mean, our young guy there did, please call me. We have young people here who've got ideas, but we cannot resolve our problems if we don't tackle the joblessness in the country. There's no livelihoods for people, and we are inviting a civil war.
Absolutely. Now, you have mentioned Africa's political instability has been rocked by the number of coups that have taken place, and the one being in Niger, as you mentioned, is part of particular interest. And uranium extracted by France, as you said, does power a third of the electricity it needs. And yet, Niger gets its power from Nigeria instead of on their own. Now, what do you feel should the new leadership of African countries be insisting on with regards to critical minerals?
As I was saying to you, that the democracies that we have often exclude the right to an economy, the right to livelihoods, the right to a democratic economy. It's just that you come in at a low level, a racialized low level, black people in the lowest rung, and they can put others as clerks. And it's a time for us to reimagine this particular relationship. Um, so these coups are attempting to correct a democracy that was denuded of questions about economic justice, right? We don't endorse coup d'etats, but they are speaking to a bigger problem, that why is it that the colonial masters continue to benefit at our expense? Here we are a free country. Why do we continue with development as colonialism? You know, Cecil John Rhodes said in the 1800s, we must find new lands for which we can easily obtain raw materials and at the same time exploit the cheap slave labor that is available from the natives of the colonies. The colonies would also provide a dumping ground for the surplus goods produced in our factories. This is from the horse's mouth, the guy who colonized much of our part of the world and called the country Rhodesia. Zimbabwe now has to deal with its anti-democratic tendencies there, of its leadership unaccountable, and start thinking of the region together with all of us, because that's the way to stop people coming across the border. We must start thinking bigger. You know, the DRC's got cobalt. We have to reimagine the sub-region. It can't just be more and more policy. We've got to implement it. We've got to create something, but make sure that communities that produce this and live near to these mines do not lose out again.
Absolutely. I think it is fair to say that a lot of African countries are still suffering the effects of colonialism, and then they are trying to move past that, and hence we do have the coups. And I completely agree with you. It is absolutely time that Africa starts making use of its own resources in a way that does benefit African countries. But now, in terms of the work done by the Benchmarks Foundation, how can communities become more empowered and really benefit when they live close to these critical mineral areas?
We we seek to make a number of demands. Firstly, when a community is organized, we have a community monitor who monitors the conduct of the corporation. Usually, the rubbish that they push into the community is polluted water. You know, the tailing dams that burst. There's one that burst in Zululand Anthracite Colliery in KZN, one that burst in Jagersfontein. These just continue. At the dawn of our democracy, there was one that burst. Now you can imagine that tailings will burst because of the extremities of heat and cold. This is the waste of mining. And when they start killing people, because this is what they do, they don't choose to say, no, I'm not going to go to Ibrahim or Sipo. It just goes because it takes away towns and villages. So it's a reason why this should become a real issue. So we're organizing around these issues. We're also asking communities to become more aware about what is the product, what is being mined next to you, what is the value every day. Because all we say is that, oh, I've got silicosis because of gold mining, etc., or the dust from the mining. We want to now name these mines, name the product, get more sophisticated in terms of a scientific literacy, find out that PB is lead. What has lead done to the people in Kabwe, in Zimbabwe, where mega cases being fought, and Anglo and others are fighting tooth and nail not to see justice. And yet, Anglo will have a human rights department. So clearly, the struggle is uphill, but the media must continue to educate around them. And we're hoping that we can tell our leaders, listen, be smart, that these things don't just have to leave our country. If there's jobs, employ local people. But what we also need to do is to make sure that the local people, their health is protected, that a certain dispensation from the taxation and royalties goes specifically to these communities to make sure that they're better off. Because it's immoral that I, living here in Lens, well, not so far from a mining area, right, can live longer than someone living in Soweto next to the mine dump or Rivoli. It just, it, it is wrong. And the mining sector is a destructive one. It kills. You know, the Minerals Council themselves have said over the last 100 and some odd years of mining, 80,000 people have died. And they say it, and it's an understatement, right? But it means that if a mine worker goes to work, they kiss their family members goodbye for real because they're not sure whether they'll come back alive, you know? So we need to start finding ways of how we can sustain ourselves if minerals are necessary. How can it make sure that it's not at the expense of our water supplies? How can we make sure it's not at the expense of people's lives? Because invariably, so much water is used to dig out an ounce of gold or whatever mineral. And then you have to deal with the waste thereafter, you know? So clearly we have to start thinking, as many faiths have been talking about, what is our common future, right? What is it? How do we look after Mother Earth? What's the use you can have a shiny jewel, but you won't have water to drink? We are semi-arid here, and we have a water problem. We are a thirsty country.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. It's absolutely imperative that corporations are accountable and do consider the impacts of the communities in these areas where these raw materials are drawn from, and find ways to really empower the people in that area. And on that note, we do know that you are hosting an annual conference very, very soon. Can you please share with our viewers more about the annual conference that will be hosted in Johannesburg next week? And who are some of the speakers that we can expect from the conference? And if there are any viewers who want to take part, how can they get involved?
We are available on a online Zoom, and we're exploring whether to put it on Facebook Live and YouTube as well. So that's where the others, but it's also in person. So we're meeting at a hotel, which I don't have to advertise, but it's in Joburg. And that we're trying to get a number of speakers that can give us this global perspective. So you have Soli Mapaila from the Communist Party. He'll be speaking, and we're hoping that he can take this debate into the ruling party, because they are silent. I don't see in their policy documents anything about this. And I wonder, how can they get jobs? You saw what happened to the National Development Plan. We're not meeting our targets, because the question is how? How can you meet these targets of making sure people are healthier, etc., without them working? And then you complain that they're getting a handout. So Solly is one of them. Then we've got Yao Graham from the Third World Network, incredibly astute intellectual. He's Third World Network Africa. They work and they give it the very big picture of what they think African leaders should be concentrating on. And sometimes they advise some of these leaders, not that they always listen. And then we've got Rahmi Hertanti, who is from Indonesia. She is the organizer of the Thematic Social Forum in Indonesia that happens after our meeting. And she'll speak to us about our conference. She'll speak at our conference about what was the experience of Indonesia. But you must know, Indonesia was a very powerful country during the 50s and 60s. It inspired many of the third world leaders to think about another way, away from the path of American imperialism or others. China was part of that. It was the Bandung Conference and stuff like that, where they wanted to have a proud African and Asian and Latin American countries carving a way that will benefit their people. And whenever you say this, there used to be coups d'etats or wars in your country. So clearly we hope they would share with us. And then of course we have a number of panels where incredibly powerful people from Heinrich Ball, South African mining communities that are all there, Makua, Wamua, various of these activists will be participating in working groups, looking at why there's no jobs, what has happened to this beneficiation. All those strategies we'll be exploring in 4 working groups. The role of women, will it be the same? Or will this opportunity prevail for some gender justice, So we want to get into that small gap to say, leaders, wake up. I really would like to engage our leaders, because we don't hear them speak about this. There are a number of conferences being held around this topic. And for a person to attend, it costs you about 30,000, right? And I don't know what they're saying, but I guess what they are saying is, I can get you this access to this mineral at this rate. We cannot continue like that. It's unpatriotic.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I definitely think that this conference is definitely going to bring out a lot of incredible conversation and a lot of necessary conversation in order to move forward for Africa as a continent, and how, we can better serve these communities, or these mining communities rather. I definitely think it's going to be interesting. Thank you so much for joining us on INX Prime, and thank you so much for sharing and engaging with us this evening.
It's my pleasure. Thank you very much.
To our viewers, that is going to be the conference that is going to be taking place next week. If this is a topic that interests you and it is a topic you would like to be part of the conversation and you would like to know more, please do. I do believe there is availability for you to attend online or in person. But on that note, we are going to take a very quick ad break and we'll see you when we come back.